A settler-rich man rejected his new bride in public for another woman, until he realized he made a big mistake of rejecting her. Her name was Florence, though few here knew it yet. Her figure was slim but unyielding, like a sapling stubbornly rooted against prairie winds. She wore a simple blue dress, the color of a fading sky, with a hemline frayed by many repairs. Her face, though youthful, carried the delicate exhaustion of someone who had crossed more than just miles to stand here. Florence did not step down with the giddy eagerness of a new bride. She stepped as one careful not to wake old ghosts. The townsfolk watched her, subtle as circling hawks. A few men tilted their hats forward in casual appraisal. A group of women in starched bonnets murmured behind gloved hands. Children, dirt-smudged and wide-eyed, pointed at her carpetbag, guessing aloud what treasures it might hide. Florence kept her chin level, her steps even, her heart a frantic bird behind her ribs. Somewhere in this crowd, a man was waiting for her. A man who had written words dipped in honey, promises wound tight with hope. A man who had painted pictures of land rich with wheat and a house with a porch big enough for rocking chairs and laughter. A man who had signed his letters Hoged Vane. And there he was, standing a little apart from the crowd, arms crossed over a chest clothed in fine linen and a brown waistcoat sharp enough to slice bread. His boots gleamed like black water. His hat sat low over eyes that scanned the platform with growing impatience. His mouth was a tight line, twitching at the corners as he spotted her. For a long, breathless moment, Florence allowed herself to believe. Maybe the sunlight was playing tricks. Maybe he was only stunned at how well she had kept herself, how hopeful she looked even after so many storms. She lifted a hand in a small, shy wave. Hoged did not wave back. Instead, he stepped forward with the careful calculation of a man inspecting livestock at market. His eyes traveled from the worn edges of her dress to the scuffs on her boots, the stubborn squareness of her shoulders, and something unseen shifted in his face, a subtle recoiling, like a door slowly shutting. The crowd, sensing the tremor in the air, began to still. Conversations faded to hushed rustles. Florence could hear the ticking of the station clock, the faint clatter of dishes in the saloon down the street, the lonely creak of a sign swinging in the hot wind. Hoged approached, clearing his throat once, as if summoning the courage for a distasteful task. When he spoke, his voice was too low for the gathering crowd to hear, but Florence heard every word. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's been a mistake. I was expecting someone else." Her body stiffened, but her face remained composed, a mask of quiet civility. "I'm sure you're a fine woman," he said, looking over her shoulder as if already dismissing her to the past. "But I need someone more suitable. Understand, these are hard lands. Demands a certain refinement." The words might have been polite, but they landed with the weight of stones. Florence, feeling every eye on her, drew a slow breath through her nose, letting it steady her. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure glide forward, a woman with hair the color of spun gold, dress catching the sunlight like a flame. Dorothea Mayfield, daughter of the wealthiest rancher this side of the river. Her laugh, high and lilting, broke the heavy air like a whip crack. Hoged turned from Florence without another word, offering Dorothea his arm with a practiced bow. Together, they strolled away, their departure as final and sharp as a slammed door. For a moment, Florence stood frozen. Not from shame, not from anger. From the dizzying realization that she was alone again, not just in a new town, but in a new life where the rules she thought she knew had shifted under her feet. A few sympathetic glances drifted her way, quickly hidden. The station master, a bent old man with a face like a wrinkled map, shuffled toward her, muttering something about the boarding house up the street, if she needed a place. Florence nodded, lips pressed tight to dam the ache swelling in her throat. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She bent slowly, gathering her carpetbag, the cracked leather handle rough against her palms. The bag felt heavier now, not with clothes or keepsakes, but with the invisible weight of dreams deferred. The sun pressed against her back like a hand, urging her forward into a future she had not asked for. The last whistle of the departing train sliced the silence, its lonely wail carrying across the endless, unbroken fields beyond the town. A sound of endings, but perhaps also of beginnings too small yet to be seen. With measured steps, Florence crossed the platform. Her boots kicked up small puffs of dust, each one swirling briefly before settling back to earth. She walked past the whispering women, the boys with gap-toothed grins, the old men who tilted their hats in silent apology. She did not look back. Ahead, the town spread out in humble defiance against the wildness of the land, a scatter of wooden buildings, horses tied in lazy knots outside the saloon, a general store with windows reflecting the endless sky. It was not much, but it was something. A place to start again. Somewhere, in the ripple of heat over the street, she thought she saw a figure waiting. Not Hoged, not anyone she knew. Just a man leaning against a wagon, watching her approach with a kind of patient curiosity. He made no move toward her, made no demands of her presence. He simply waited. Florence tightened her grip on her bag and kept walking, dust clinging to her hem, heart thudding a slow, steady rhythm of survival. Behind her, the platform emptied, the onlookers losing interest, the drama concluded. Life returned to its sluggish, sun-beaten pace. Chickens scurried. A dog barked once and lay down again. Somewhere a door slammed, and laughter tumbled out into the thick air. But Florence heard none of it. She heard only the whisper of her own spirit gathering itself, sewing itself back together with invisible thread. She had come to this land to find a future, and though it was not the one she had imagined, it was hers now to claim. The prairie stretched out before her like a page unwritten, vast and wild and brimming with possibilities both cruel and kind. Florence straightened her spine against the weight of that knowing and walked forward, each step a quiet declaration. I am not undone. Not by a man. Not by the loneliness. Not by the endless, aching sky. The town swallowed her up in its dusty embrace, and the story, her story, began anew. The afternoon hung heavy and golden, thick with dust and a brittle kind of waiting. Florence stood outside the general store, hands folded neatly around her carpet-bag, feeling the weight of 100 glances snagging against her like burrs. She had rented a room above the store, a modest space with thin walls and a view of the mercantile's flat roof, where pigeons gathered like gossiping old women. Below her, the street bustled with the slow, deliberate life of a small town. Wagons creaked past, dogs chased each other between wagon wheels, and children, freed from the morning's lessons, shrieked as they tumbled down the street like autumn leaves caught in a restless breeze. But beneath it all was a hum of something else, something sharper. News traveled faster than trains in towns like these. Florence's arrival, her rejection, her quiet retreat, they had already become part of the town's living memory, stitched into its daily rhythm. She could feel it whenever she passed a group of townsfolk huddled too closely together, their eyes darting away when she looked up. She could hear it in the way conversations shifted as she approached, in the way doors closed a little too quickly behind her. In this place, she was not simply Florence. She was that woman. Still, she moved through her days with measured grace. She took her meals in her room, mending her few dresses by lamplight, the needle's thin song stitching through the silence. She offered polite nods to those who dared meet her gaze, and only rarely did she allow herself the indulgence of imagining what her life might have been had Hoged Vane kept his promises. On a morning stitched together by the cries of mourning doves, Florence ventured out early, before the day's heat grew oppressive. The air was soft and still, thick with the scent of dust and horse sweat. She crossed the main street, heading for the well where townsfolk gathered each day to draw water. She was lowering her bucket when she heard it, laughter, bright and brittle as shattering glass. Turning, she saw them, Hoged Vane and Dorothea Mayfield, side by side atop a gleaming new carriage. Hoged wore a broad smile, his white teeth flashing in the sun, while Dorothea, perched high and haughty as a queen, waved her lace-gloved hand at passing townsfolk like royalty acknowledging their subjects. Their carriage rolled to a stop directly across from the well. Hoged, spotting Florence, stiffened almost imperceptibly, but recovered quickly, tipping his hat in her direction with a flourish so practiced it seemed a performance meant for the onlookers rather than for her. Dorothea leaned close to him, whispering something that made Hoged chuckle. She looked Florence over with slow, deliberate disdain, as if inspecting a piece of furniture left too long in the sun. The moment stretched thin, brittle as ice. Florence straightened, her hands folding neatly over her skirt. She returned Hoged's greeting with a nod so slight it could hardly be called a gesture at all. Her heart beat a slow, steady drum against her ribs, each thud reminding her, "You are whole, you are unbroken, you are enough." Hogod dismounted with a flourish, dusting imaginary dirt from his sleeve. He helped Dorothea down, his hand lingering a moment too long at her waist, the movement exaggerated for any who cared to notice. And notice they did. The whole town seemed to pivot on its axis to bear witness. Florence stood her ground. Hogod approached, his boots scuffing against the dry earth, a hesitant smile twitching at the corners of his mouth. He removed his hat, twisting it in his hands like a schoolboy caught in mischief. "Miss Florence," he began, voice syrupy and loud enough to carry to every ear within 100 paces. "I do hope you're finding yourself well situated." The words, on the surface polite, were dipped in venom. A reminder of her place. A mockery wrapped in a gentleman's coat. Florence inclined her head, her voice calm and clear. "I am well enough, Mr. Vane. Thank you for your concern." Hogod's smile faltered, just slightly, and Dorothea stepped closer, slipping her hand through the crook of his arm with possessive ease. She smiled too, a sharp-edged thing, all teeth and triumph. "We do hope you'll find something suitable to occupy your time here," Dorothea said, her voice dripping sweetness, the words hollow and cold. "After all, not everyone is cut out for the demands of frontier life." The crowd, sensing blood in the water, tittered softly. A murmur moved through them like wind through dry grass. Florence met Dorothea's gaze, steady and unflinching. "Thank you, Miss Mayfield," she said, each syllable a thread woven from dignity and iron. "I have every confidence that I will thrive, no matter the soil." A beat of silence, sharp and startling. Then a voice, rough and low, broke it, the station master, standing by his water barrels, grunting his approval under his breath. A few others followed, subtle nods, murmured agreements too quiet to be called rebellion but real enough to be felt. Hogod's face darkened. He tugged Dorothea away, muttering something too soft to hear, and together they climbed back into their shining carriage, the horses stamping and tossing their manes as if eager to be gone. As the carriage rattled away, Florence turned back to her bucket, lowering it once more into the dark, cool depths of the well. Her reflection shimmered on the surface, a woman standing alone, yes, but standing nonetheless. She filled her pail and straightened, the water heavy in her arms, the weight of it grounding her to the earth. The town slowly returned to its business, but the air had changed. Eyes still followed her, but now there was something else in them, something softer. Curiosity, perhaps. Respect, even, though they did not yet have the words for it. She carried the water back across the street, her steps unhurried. She did not glance back at the retreating carriage, did not chase the pieces of herself Hogod had tried to scatter like broken glass across the town square. Instead, she moved forward. In the days that followed, Florence wove herself into the fabric of the town with quiet tenacity. She took work mending clothes for the shopkeeper's wife, tutoring the blacksmith's youngest daughter in her letters. She sang softly in the small church on Sundays, her voice blending into the rough, hopeful harmonies of the congregation. She smiled at the children who darted past her skirts and nodded to the old men who tipped their hats in silent greeting. She built a life not from grand gestures or dramatic triumphs, but from small kindnesses, small connections, each one a stone laid carefully into the foundation of something lasting. Hogod Vane and Dorothea Mayfield continued to glide through the town like royalty, but their shine began to dull. Whispers followed them now, rumors of Hogod's gambling debts, Dorothea's sharp tongue. The townsfolk, once eager to bask in their reflected glory, began to turn away, their affections shifting like leaves in an autumn wind. And Florence, once pitied, once scorned, found herself quietly, steadily rising. Not through spectacle, not through revenge, through resilience, through grace, through the stubborn, breathtaking beauty of a heart that refused to harden. As she stood one evening on the steps of the general store, watching the sun spill its final gold across the rooftops, Florence allowed herself a small, secret smile. The land stretched out before her, vast and wild and brimming with promise. And somewhere, beyond the glare of petty men and shallow women, something, or someone, was waiting. Not a rescuer. Not a redeemer. An equal. The thought settled around her like a cloak, warm and sure. And when she stepped down from the porch and into the rising dust of twilight, it was with the quiet certainty of someone who knew that her story had only just begun. The days slipped past like pages fluttering in a soft wind, each one carrying Florence a little farther from the sharp memory of Hoged Vane and the humiliation he had carved into the dusty streets of the town. Summer began to ripen at the edges, and the sky stretched wider and more forgiving above the rooftops. The earth baked beneath the weight of the sun, and the air held the faint tang of ripening crops and distant rain yet to fall. It was on a day stitched with the weary hum of locusts that Florence first truly saw Daniel Hart. She had seen him before, in passing, a figure of quiet strength moving among the townsfolk without much notice. He was not a man of loud greetings or grand gestures. He seemed stitched into the very fabric of the town, part of the landscape like the weathered boards of the general store or the bent fences leaning against the stubborn will of the wind. Daniel was neither young nor old, but wore the kind of face the land carved, lines etched by years of work, skin burnished by sun and dust. His hair was the color of dry wheat and always seemed a little tousled, as if the wind could not help but touch him. His eyes were the color of river stones, steady, unhurried, reflecting rather than reaching. That morning, Florence had been struggling with her carpet-bag outside the mercantile, the handle finally giving up after so many weeks of stubborn loyalty. Her few belongings spilled across the steps, a worn shawl, a frayed book of poems, a hand-stitched journal with its pages curling at the edges like autumn leaves. She knelt, gathering them quickly, cheeks burning, when a shadow fell across her. Without a word, Daniel crouched beside her, lifting the bag with careful hands, as if it were something fragile and precious. He produced a length of rawhide from the pocket of his trousers, his fingers working deftly, binding the broken handle with quiet efficiency. Florence sat back on her heels, watching him. "Thank you," she said softly when he straightened and handed the bag back to her, his eyes meeting hers with a kind of quiet acknowledgment that needed no further words. Daniel tipped his hat, a small, solemn gesture, and turned to go. She could have let him. She could have clutched her repaired bag and retreated to the safety of her room, her stitched-together pride intact. Instead, something inside her, some small, stubborn seed of hope, pushed her to speak again. Would you join me for coffee?" The words tasted strange on her tongue, bold and tremulous all at once. Daniel paused, one boot already on the dusty road. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if weighing not the offer but the heart that had dared to make it. A slow, almost imperceptible smile curved his mouth. "Reckon I could," he said, voice low and steady as a river at dusk. They sat at a rough-hewn table outside the store, enamel cups between them steaming with the sharp, bitter scent of boiled coffee. The sun hung low and heavy, painting the world in molten gold, and the cicadas sang their endless hymn to the dying day. Their conversation unfolded not in great torrents, but in small, careful tributaries. Florence learned that Daniel worked as a carpenter and sometimes as a blacksmith when extra hands were needed. He spoke sparingly, his words chosen like stones laid to build a sure path rather than tossed carelessly into the wind. She told him little of herself, not out of mistrust, but because there were some wounds that required time and tenderness to reveal. Still, Daniel did not press her. His presence was a quiet invitation rather than a demand. As the sky bruised into purple and the first stars began to stitch themselves into the darkening fabric of evening, Daniel rose. "Ma'am," he said, dipping his head, "should you ever need anything, repairs or such, you've only to ask." Florence smiled, small but real. "Thank you, Mr. Hart." Daniel's smile flickered wider for a heartbeat. "Daniel will do just fine." He tipped his hat again and walked away, his figure swallowed slowly by the gathering dusk. That night, Florence sat by her window, the breeze lifting the edge of the curtain, carrying with it the scent of distant sage and the faint, dry music of crickets. She pressed her forehead to the glass, feeling the coolness seep into her skin, and allowed herself to wonder, not foolishly, not desperately, but quietly, cautiously, if perhaps the soil of this town was not as barren as it had once seemed. In the days that followed, she and Daniel crossed paths often. Sometimes it was as simple as a nod exchanged across the street, or a brief conversation about the weather, the crops, the stubbornness of the mayor's mule. Sometimes he would leave small things by her door, a bundle of kindling when the nights grew cooler, a small sack of apples from the early harvest, a carving knife when he heard from the shopkeeper that she had been borrowing a dull blade. Never once did he linger or expect gratitude. Never once did he press himself upon her life. He simply stayed, steady as the hills beyond the town, patient as the slow unfolding of a storm-washed flower. The town noticed, of course. Towns always notice. Whispers trailed them like the long shadows of evening, soft and speculative, but neither Florence nor Daniel gave them any nourishment. What bloomed between them was not a thing shouted from rooftops or scrawled in bold ink across ledgers. It was a thing built in the quiet, in the spaces between words, in the silences that said more than clumsy declarations ever could. One afternoon, while Florence hung laundry on the line behind the boarding house, Daniel approached, carrying a rough-hewn birdhouse he had made from scraps of cedar. He held it out to her without preamble. "Saw the sparrows scuffling over that eave by your window," he said. "Thought they might appreciate a proper roof." Florence took the birdhouse in her hands, running her fingers over the smooth wood, the careful joints, the tiny carved heart at the base where it would rest against the wall. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, her voice catching slightly. He nodded once, his hands hooking into his belt, and for a moment they simply stood there, the fresh laundry snapping in the rising breeze, the birdhouse heavy with meaning between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was something real, something sturdy enough to bear the weight of all that might come. That night, Florence sat at her window once more, the birdhouse nestled on the sill, waiting to be hung in the morning light. She watched the stars prick holes in the velvet dark, each one a tiny defiance against the swallowing void. Her heart felt the same, battered, weathered, but still stubbornly alight. She thought of Hoggett Vane and Dorothea Mayfield, of all the empty promises and shallow dreams she had left behind on the cracked boards of the train station. She thought of Daniel Hart, and the way he moved through the world with a kind of quiet reverence for all things broken and beautiful. And she smiled, not with the fragile hope of a woman desperate for rescue, but with the grounded, growing certainty of someone who had learned to recognize the rare and precious when it came walking slowly up the road. The night deepened around her, warm and thick, and somewhere out beyond the town, a coyote howled, a wild, lonesome sound, both sorrowful and brave. Florence pressed her palm flat against the glass, feeling the heartbeat of the land thrum against her skin. She was not finished. She was only just beginning. And somewhere, quietly and steadfastly, Daniel Hart was waiting, not to save her, not to mend her, but simply to walk beside her through whatever rough country lay ahead. The first bite of autumn crept into the evenings, subtle and patient. The heat that had once pressed down like a smothering hand began to lift, and the fields beyond the town shifted from gold to a brittle brown. Smoke from hearths curled into the cooling sky, and the scent of wood smoke clung to the hem of every passer-by. Life in the town slowed in rhythm with the season, each day folding gently into the next. Florence found herself thriving in small, unexpected ways. Her sewing work grew from mere mending to crafting fine dresses for the preacher's daughters and sturdy coats for the ranchers preparing for winter's bite. The children she tutored began leaving small gifts for her on the church steps: a twist of yarn, a polished stone, a hastily scrawled thank-you note folded into shy, awkward corners. She gathered these offerings like rare flowers, pressing them deep into her heart. Daniel remained a constant, a steady drumbeat against the background of her days. He helped fix the sagging step outside the boarding house without being asked. He left jars of preserves by her door as the harvest came in, the lids sealed with rough labels scrawled in his careful hand. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. Their companionship did not need the frantic declarations others seemed to believe necessary. It grew slowly, like roots threading deep into rich earth. It was during one of those early dusks, when the air hummed with the scent of dry leaves and far-off rain, that Hoggett Vane returned. Florence saw him first from her window, a darker shape against the worn road leading into town. He rode a tired-looking mare, dust streaking his boots and coat. His face, once full of bright, easy smiles, now looked drawn and weathered, as if the summer had wrung something vital out of him. She watched without moving, her heart calm. She felt no fear, no anger, not even the bitter satisfaction she might have once imagined savoring. Only a quiet, almost tender sorrow for what might have been, and never was meant to be. Word of his return spread through town like a whispered prayer. By the time the sun bled fully into the horizon, Hoggett was seated alone at the corner table of the saloon, nursing a whiskey with the desperation of a man who once thought himself above desperation. The next morning, Florence stepped lightly down the steps of the boarding house, her basket of mending balanced against her hip. She did not expect to see him waiting at the bottom of the stairs, hat clutched in his hands like a boy about to confess to breaking a windowpane. "Florence," he said, voice roughened by dust and regret. She stopped a safe distance away, studying him without hostility, without warmth. "I reckon I owe you an apology," he said, eyes darting briefly to her basket, then back to her face. His words stumbled over themselves, falling into the silence between them. "I was wrong," he said finally. "About you. About everything." The street stretched empty around them, the town holding its collective breath. A few faces peeked from behind lace curtains, a few heads turned under the guise of tending storefronts. Florence knew they were watching. She knew it did not matter. "I made a mistake," Hogan said, his voice dropping. I thought I needed something else. Someone else. But Dorothea, she's gone. Took what she wanted and lit out for Denver, left me with nothing but debts and a bad name." He stepped closer, the leather of his boots creaking. "You were kind, Florence. You were honest. I see that now. I was a fool." Florence looked at him, truly looked at him, at the sag of his shoulders, the crack in his proud voice, the raw hunger in his eyes for something steady, something real. For a flicker of a second, she saw the man she had once hoped he might be. And then she saw the truth. He was not sorry for the way he had wounded her, only sorry that it had left him empty-handed. She shifted her basket higher on her hip, feeling the solid weight of it anchor her to the earth. "I forgive you," she said, her voice as soft and clear as a church bell in winter air. Hogan's face crumpled in relief, the first smile breaking across his face like a thaw. "But that does not mean I will have you," she continued, the words steady and without cruelty. "What you are looking for, you must find in yourself, not in someone else." Hogan's mouth opened and closed once, like a man who had lost the thread of the conversation entirely. She stepped past him, her skirt brushing lightly against the dust, leaving him standing there in the full, unforgiving light of day. At the corner, she found Daniel leaning against the hitching post outside the smithy, arms crossed loosely over his chest. He had watched, she knew, not with jealousy, not with anger, but with the steady patience that had always defined him. He tipped his hat as she approached, a small smile tilting one corner of his mouth. "All right then," he asked, the words simple, the meaning vast. "All right," she said, and meant it. They walked side by side toward the store, toward the life that awaited them. Not hand in hand, not yet, but with the easy, measured rhythm of two souls that had found, at last, a cadence that fit. That evening, Florence stood on her porch, the repaired birdhouse hanging above her window, a faint silhouette against the deepening indigo sky. The town around her settled into the soft murmur of twilight, a dog barking at nothing in particular, a child laughing somewhere in the distance, the low hum of a fiddle drifting from the saloon. She breathed in the cool air, filling her lungs with the scent of dry leaves and distant, promised rain. Daniel came up the steps, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed her one without a word and settled onto the top step, stretching his long legs out before him. They sat in silence, the kind of silence that needs no filling. After a while, Florence spoke, her voice low. "I thought once that love would come like thunder, like a river breaking its banks." Daniel sipped his coffee, waiting. "But maybe it comes like this instead," she said. "Quiet, patient, certain as the turning of the seasons." Daniel smiled into his cup. "I reckon it does," he said. The stars blinked open overhead, one by one, and the night folded itself around them like a worn, beloved quilt. Florence felt the last fragile threads of her old life fall away, carried off on the sighing wind. What remained was not loss, not emptiness, but space, vast and rich and waiting. Daniel turned his head, looking at her with that steady, seeing gaze. "Florence," he said, "if ever you think you might want more than coffee and quiet evenings, you've only to say." She looked at him, at the sure curve of his mouth, at the hands that built things meant to last, and felt something deep within her, something strong and certain, shift into place. "Not yet," she said, smiling. "But soon." Daniel tipped his hat back and laughed, a low, warm sound that rolled into the night like distant thunder. They sat until the chill of evening seeped into their bones and the stars crowded thick and bright overhead, 2 figures carved out of dust and time and stubborn hope, rooted deeply in a world that had tried its best to break them and failed. The night whispered around them, carrying the promise of a new season, a new beginning, a life built not from regret, but from the steadfast, simple miracle of staying. And somewhere deep in the heart of that quiet, unfolding world, the first seeds of love took root, unseen but certain, ready to bloom. The first sign came not from the sky, but from the earth. A low, shuddering murmur threaded through the soles of their boots one evening as Florence and Daniel stood outside the general store, a slow, patient vibration like some great animal stirring in its sleep. The air, already heavy with the scent of distant rain, seemed to thicken, pressing close against their skin. Daniel turned his face to the horizon, his brow furrowed, the mug of coffee in his hand forgotten. "The river," he said, almost to himself. Florence followed his gaze. Far off, beyond the stitched line of the town's edge, a thin, dark smear lay across the land. Clouds, she thought at first, but no, it moved too swiftly, too hungrily. The rains had been heavy upriver, and now the swollen waters were coming, bearing down on the low fields and the fragile spine of the town itself. Without a word, Daniel set his cup down and moved, his long strides eating up the distance toward his workshop. Florence, heart thudding not with fear but with a fierce, sudden resolve, followed. The town had no siren, no bell to sound the alarm. Word traveled mouth to mouth, hand to shoulder, shout to doorframe. Lights bloomed in windows, boots hit packed dirt, and voices rose into the night air, urgent and strained. The flood would not sweep through the town square itself. The heart of the settlement sat just high enough on its gentle rise. But the outer buildings, the fields, the precious work of so many hands would not be so lucky. Daniel's workshop stood near the edge, where the ground dipped away toward the river's greedy path. By the time they reached it, water was already seeping into the cracks between the boards, dark and glistening. Daniel threw open the doors, his body all motion, all purpose. He moved through the dim interior, gathering tools, crates, anything light enough to save but important enough to matter. Without hesitation, Florence stepped inside after him, her skirts dragging through the rising damp. She grabbed what she could, stacking planks and carving tools, wrapping finished work in oilcloth to protect it. Daniel caught her eye once, about to protest, but she shook her head once, fiercely, and he understood. They worked in tandem, the trust between them so seamless it needed no words. Outside, others came running. Townsfolk who had once whispered behind their hands about Florence, about Daniel, about all the things they did not understand. Now, in the face of greater need, such smallness fell away. The station master barked orders. The blacksmith's sons heaved heavy benches onto wagons. Even old Miss Turner from the boarding house, her back bent and her hands twisted with arthritis, tottered forward to offer oilskins and blankets. The water was a living thing now, a roaring, churning creature that tore at fences, lifted barrels, snatched away anything not anchored deep to the earth. It licked at the porch of the workshop, groping hungrily for more. Daniel heaved the last crate onto a wagon and turned to Florence, his face hard with the knowledge of what they could not save. The workshop itself would be lost. There was no fighting the river's hunger. He caught her hand in his, rough and calloused and warm. "Let it go," he said. She nodded, chest tight with the pain of it, but stronger still was the knowledge that what mattered could not be swept away. Together they climbed onto the wagon, Daniel snapping the reins hard, the mule lurching into motion. They fled before the water's onrushing fury, the river howling its rage behind them. When they reached the square, higher and dry, the townsfolk gathered, a huddle of soaked, mud-streaked souls bound now by something stronger than gossip or convenience. They watched in silence as the river consumed the outer edges of their town, a relentless black tongue licking at the borders of their lives. Florence stood beside Daniel, their shoulders brushing, neither reaching for the other, but bound nevertheless by something fierce and wordless. As dawn bled slowly into the sky, the river began to recede, sated for now. What it left behind was ruin, and the raw, aching possibility of renewal. The workshop was gone, carried off in splinters and sorrow. Fields lay flattened, crops tangled and drowned. But the town stood. Its heart beat still, stubborn and unbowed. And within that heart, Florence and Daniel stood too, battered but unbroken. The days that followed were a blur of labor. Men and women worked side by side, salvaging what they could, building what they must. No one stood idle. No one waited to be asked. Florence stitched tarpaulins into makeshift shelters. Daniel, stripped to his shirt sleeves, swung a hammer with relentless focus, raising walls where none stood before. The blacksmith's daughter brought soup in battered tin bowls. The preacher's wife patched clothes with trembling, arthritic fingers. Even Hoged Vane, humbled and gaunt, turned up to swing a shovel until his palms bled. There was no room now for pride, or pity, or old wounds. Only work. Only survival. Only the slow, stubborn planting of new hope in sodden soil. One evening, long after the sun had bled its last into the land, Daniel found Florence sitting alone on the steps of the newly raised community hall, a rough but sturdy structure that would serve until the church could be repaired. He sat beside her without a word, their bodies casting long shadows into the cooling dust. They sat that way for a long while, watching the stars struggle into being overhead, pale and flickering against the bruised sky. At last, Daniel spoke, his voice low. "I lost a lot," he said. "That workshop was my livelihood. My pride." Florence turned her head, studying his profile in the faint starlight, the hard line of his jaw, the gentle set of his mouth. "But looking at you now," he said, "I don't feel the loss the way I thought I would." She felt her breath catch, not with fear, but with something deeper, richer, the slow, unfolding wonder of being seen, truly seen. "You built things with your hands, Daniel Hart," she said softly. "But you also built things with your heart." His smile, when it came, was slow and sure. "And I reckon I'd like to keep building, Florence Hayes. If you'll have me." There were no grand declarations. No bended knees or glittering rings. Only two battered souls, offering what little they had left, and finding it more than enough. Florence reached out, her fingers finding his, their hands tangling together with the easy certainty of roots winding deep into rich, waiting earth. "I'll have you, Daniel," she said, her voice steady as the hills. "And I'll build with you." He pressed a kiss to her knuckles, reverent and sure, sealing the promise with the tenderness of a man who understood the true weight of oaths. Around them, the town pulsed with the quiet thrum of life beginning again. Hammers rang out from the forge. Laughter spilled from open windows. Babies cried. Dogs barked. Men and women shouted greetings across streets still thick with drying mud. It was not the world they had known before. It was something new. Something hard-won. Something fiercely beautiful. Florence leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath the rough fabric of his shirt. They would build a home, not just of wood and nails, but of shared labor, of kindness offered and received, of dreams planted deep and tended with patient hands. They would weather storms, for storms would surely come again. The land demanded no less of those who dared call it home. But they would weather them together. As the stars thickened overhead, spinning their slow, ancient dance, Daniel rose and helped Florence to her feet. They walked back through the sleeping town, past crooked fences and broken fields, past scars left by the flood and the stubborn blooming seeds of tomorrow. Hand in hand. Shoulder to shoulder. Heart to heart. The prairie stretched before them, vast and wild and achingly beautiful, singing its endless, wordless song of loss and renewal. And in that great whispering chorus, Florence and Daniel added their own small, defiant note, not loud, but true. Not thunder. Not river. But the deep, abiding rhythm of two souls choosing, again and again, to stay. To build. To love.